Hi, everyone. Welcome to Video Games Industry Real Talk. I'm Alexander Fernandez with my co-host.
Hey, I'm Stefan Baier. I'm also here.
Something like that as we get there. This is our actual first podcast dedicated towards discussing relevant issues facing the video games industry. We're coming at it from a business and game development and game developer point of view. What we're not doing is discussing the relevance of any specific video game title, as much as what we're looking at is the games industry, the business, the development, and what it takes to actually make these products.
Yes, the actual people behind it, the developers, and the business that makes it run.
So this is interesting. You know, Streamline, you and me making video games for 20 years. What do you think is our primary motivating factor for doing this?
Well, I think, we come out of the same kind of mold that I think a lot of the current developers that have been around for a while, where they're coming from is this kind of 90s kind of creative community, like where we were the outcasts, and that I think that fierce independence streak has been with us ever since then, and I think that's really motivating. That you can essentially try to be creative, express yourself, carve your own path, and I think that has driven a lot of people that I think we like to work with still to this day. So I blame our childhood.
In our childhood backgrounds, how we came up in the games industry has absolutely affected us and is one of the main driving reasons why we're actually doing this podcast. I think it's important for people to know that we have been working in the video games industry for more than 20 years. Our company that we co-founded, Streamline Studios, which is now Streamline Media Group, has been working in video games since 2001. It's been a long time. What do you think, Stefan?
Yeah, no, it's a long time, but I mean, it takes time. Games nowadays can take like 3-4 years alone. So, in terms of large titles, we're like 4 or 5 old, So it's crazy.
Yeah, this is going to be our, what is this? PlayStation 2 had just been out when we started. Play PS3, PS4, obviously Xbox 360.
I don't really think about the in-between so much. I think about like the beginning times, like that, at least for me, the PC era of the 90s, playing like Dune 2 and Civilization and then, Duke Nukem and stuff like that, all the games like Quake that I couldn't actually play in Germany. I wasn't supposed to as a teenager, but that's what got me to
realize there's probably a host of listeners that are like, what are you talking about? Yeah. The 90s, I was like years old. I was 9 months old. I was not even born yet. So, old man Baier, why don't you explain a little bit about what you mean by that? What do you mean by the 90s? What is this fanciful time called the 90s? What was going on at that time?
There was this new thing called the internet that, like connects you to people. And back then it was actually mostly positive. There was quickly a community of sort of developers in Europe and in the US that would take existing games and modify them, like the first Quake games and the first kind of sort of 3D games especially saw like a big modding community pop up. And I think this is where we kind of got our start, met other nerds like yourself and really got into expressing yourself creatively in a way that I think, at least where I grew up, there was no place to really do that. That's how it started.
So what you're saying is we come from the generation that it was not cool to make video games. It was not cool to be in technology, and we were nerds and social outcasts. And
it was totally not cool. I mean, like for my mom would lie about what I would do, the kind of games I'd be working on, like because these action games would be called killer games, first-person shooter games. Are not cool at all. So she would say like, oh yeah, he's doing things like Mario and sports games, stuff like this, So that was definitely not a thing. And I mean, nobody picked up on it on the time, but when I worked on essentially on the Half-Life mod scene, and then making our first commercial game, like I was not 18, so I wasn't supposed to even have that game to begin with in Germany, because you had to be over 18 to purchase it. But,
I love how these were called killer games, but they were true. I mean, what else were you doing except killing? But then again, you were killing digital stuff. So, I mean, I don't know. I mean, turn on television, there's a lot worse on TV these days. I mean, clearly with everything that's happening right now, I mean.
It wasn't mainstream though. I mean, that's the main thing, right? And it was very much, I think, defined the community as a community of outcasts, people that felt that they didn't have a place in society, right? And I mean, that kind of goes into what we're talking about in this show a little bit, right? Sort of like the prejudice and understandings of different groups, you know, and how that has been changing over time, you know, and what that really means for the games industry and where they kind of came from, right? Because it started in a certain place and with certain people, and that legacy has informed it. Right.
So let's jump in then, and let's go ahead and start talking about what episode 1 is about. I'm sure our listeners out there were probably like, okay, guys, can you get on with the program? Tell us a little bit about why we're listening to this show. You know, honestly, guys, this is the first episode. And like with anything that you do, we're looking at wanting to talk about something that is really close to us, something that we've experienced. And I think that anyone that's been in this industry long enough can actually attest to. And obviously, the video games industry is a global industry, which is reaching nearly $200 billion worldwide. It has spread all over the world, countries from as far as Southeast Asia, all the way down to Latin America and Africa are now participating in global game development and publishing and release of products. However, this has not always been the case. And in fact, one of the main things that are happening with now effectively with George Floyd's killing and the entire Black Lives Movement and the fact that the United States specifically is now trying to address its own racial and, let's say, historic prejudices that haven't necessarily been rectified. It's time to look at the video games industry. We've seen this entire generational growth from a standpoint of business opportunity and wealth generated within the industry. It did spread to places like China, Southeast Asia, Malaysia, where we have a large production studio. But we saw this thing up close and personal. And Stefan, you know, as we start talking about this and looking at it from a standpoint of it's great that the games industry is global and that there's participation on a global level, but yet in really countries in the West, specifically in the United States, that global impact, that economic, social economic opportunity hasn't necessarily trickled down into urban communities, Black communities, Hispanic communities, people of color. That's really interesting. And so we're going to kind of get into it and talk about it from every perspective possible.
It's just strange to me, you know, when you think about it, that, you know, you now will have successful and great games coming out of Brazil and China and Southeast Asia and other places. And, you know, the industry in that sense has become global. But at the same time, you know, you're looking at, well, it's kind of like how people talk about it. They're like, oh, American developers are this and that. And you kind of think like, oh, that means all of America is kind of like activated and like, you know, they're making prolific amounts of video games and the community is vast and thriving, right? And I mean, it is, and there's a lot of really good stuff happening there, especially in the indie scene, you know, and obviously the large games have really pushed the tech frontier forward, you know, it's on the corporate side. But when you dig into it, you realize like a lot of people, you know, actually a lot of Americans just have never had the opportunity to actually even join that industry, right? Like, for example, the student debt thing is a huge problem that I think is just keeping tons of people just out of the industry. Right? Like they don't even have a chance to come in. And like you've mentioned, you know, when you're looking at the numbers, you know, like I've never lived in the US, but seeing that, you know, like, you know, the number of Hispanics and the Black community, like how underrepresented they are in development, just simply because they just never got the opportunity to get in. You know, it is strange that you have countries all around the world, you know, that for 20 years we ourselves haven't heard anything about, you know, are now coming out and essentially are making interesting, cool projects with Unity, with Unreal. You know, so why is that? And that's kind of like, I think, a piece to talk about. Like, why is it that like there's this rise globally with, you know, developers sort of becoming this kind of global, you know, family in some sense, but still there are these pockets of just people that are just not finding a way in, essentially.
So I think that's a very good question. And I think that requires us to look into the numbers. So we did some research. We're digging down. And basically what you're referring to right now is known as the digital divide. And in the United States, circa 2000, only 23.5% of African Americans and 23.6% of Hispanics had access to a computer. And the interesting part about this is that their homes actually only 18.9% of Blacks and 16.1% of Hispanics actually had an internet connection of any kind. Now, I grew up in the States. I am Hispanic. I grew up in Utah. And I can remember the very first time that I actually touched a computer. I was 7 years old, fascinated by it. My mother actually would later tell me one of the main reasons why she moved us to the neighborhood we moved to is because of the fact that our elementary school actually was the first in the valley to have a computer. And I remember being fascinated by this thing. And my mother apparently noticed that too. So by the time that we had turned 12, she had saved roughly 9 months worth of paycheck money in order to bring home a Packard Bell computer. Well, the reason why I bring up that story is because I've lived this statistic here. At the same time that my mother was bringing a computer home to her kids, and this is a single mom, we have uncles and we have cousins who are like, why is your mom giving you a computer? This is just kind of show you how much this created kind of a divide, because in the minds of my grandfather, he is like, why are you buying these kids a computer? They have no reason to be having a computer. He's not understanding what we're doing with this, pretty nasty looking beige box. And we're constantly on the phone, constantly behind it. Cause, clearly my grandpa's from Nicaragua. So he's like, what is this thing? It's like, go do something useful, go out and do something. So we have this computer system. But the key here is that getting that computer allowed us to learn a skill, which out of happenstance became basically this rocket ship towards economic independence, entrepreneurship, and of course, a lifelong passion with video games. And of course, meeting you, because we were able to meet you online. And of course, that brought us all together. But you look at it from the standpoint here, if in 2000, only 23% of Blacks and 23% of Hispanics have a computer, and only 18% and 16% have access to the internet, I mean, we're a outlier, because in 1994, we're doing both. I mean, this just blows my mind. Look at the statistic. It's insane.
I think what happened is, we got lucky, essentially, that, you got a computer through your mom, I got a computer through my uncle, and it just kind of got dropped on us, right? Sort of ahead of time, because, I don't think our families would have easily been able to afford it, just like, as a passing thing. So it became valuable because of that. And so we gave it attention because of that. But I think, what really was maybe underestimated back then, in general, and especially I think in America, this is true, is kind of like this thing of like, make money right now, go do something that brings cash onto the table, right? I think for a lot of people, they wanted to just kind of like, they tell their kids, make money first, bring something to the table, don't waste your time with this frivolous tech stuff, or just playing around, right? But I think what now I think is really dawning on people, or just you see this with the internet, is just like that it's about knowledge, that you can grow your skills in a way that just you weren't able to do this before. You can train yourself, you can learn different languages. For me back then it was learning English, in a way that school couldn't teach you, meeting people, that are doing tech and interesting things. And I think that, that is like almost like a cultural thing, like if you're in a society where you have huge student debts, you have, a lot of challenges in your family around you, and you can't really, see, an easy way out. You're not necessarily going to spend time with this machine that takes years of upskilling. But in the end, the upskill is actually what is going to push you forward,
Yeah. So, think about this for a second, how crazy this is, because if we're talking 2000, Streamline starts in 2001. So we're already again riding the curb here. We're ahead of the wave. And I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, just really right now, it dawned on me, our business only could happen because of the internet and because of the fact that home computing spread so rapidly, and the power of the computer systems at that time were powerful enough to be able to do the type of work we were doing. Granted, they weren't the fastest things on earth, but, think about this back then in 2001. I remember doing our first emails when I'm basically trying to get us work, and I have Americans being, where are you? And I'm like, we're in Amsterdam. And they're like, where's that? And I remember at that moment in time thinking like, wait a second, what do you mean you don't know where Amsterdam is? Now, this is not a call on education, which we can talk for hours on, but it was just more about the fact that this has always been a trend with basically the understanding of, if I don't see it, I don't know what it is, or as the Dutch say, what the farmer doesn't know, he doesn't eat. So if we're basically already encountering people in 2001 who can't even find us on a map, and then at the same time, inclusion of these computer systems to minorities, to specific parts of the population in the United States is happening, it's easy to start to understand how people are getting forgotten, and how this basically revolution that we rode on and basically made careers with completely is ignoring large sects of people in the US, while at the same time basically penetrating far-flung reaches of the world and creating economic opportunity for them. So it's kind of a strange thing to think about, if you really think about it from that perspective. Like, we're global, yet at the same time, we'd have more in common dealing with someone in Shenzhen and Shanghai than, say, in Detroit.
I think what's really, it is weird, and I think, there's a huge contradiction in the games industry. Actually, the industry has a lot of contradictions. And I think a big one is that you kind of get people coming from these two different corners, right? You've got the ones that, like us, more or less kind of stumbled into it, opened a computer and found a community that you kind of connected with. And it's kind of like the indie path, right? Like, you'll find a way, and especially now, from Khan Academy to Unreal Engine, Unity, all that stuff, and you'll learn and you'll grow and you'll make games. It's almost inevitable, right? But it gives you a certain kind of genetic code if you sort of like self-start your way into it. And then I think there's the other path, which is sort of the career path, more the corporate path. It's like you go to a school, you take your courses, you think that's what you need. You may or may not need those courses, but you'll have the debt to pay afterwards. And you're much more likely to end up in the corporate path, going to one of the bigger companies. And then, you're in that system, and that's a very different way of thinking and making games. And I think that divide, it keeps perpetuating itself. Right. And I think both sides kind of look at the other and be like, that's not a healthy way of doing it. Right. Like, it's risky to just kind of stumble into games, rather do a course and then join, a big publicly traded game studio, and vice versa. For the indies, they're like, well, if you need to like creatively express yourself to actually do something unique, you need to do that path. Right. And I think that, because it's also so divided like that, it maybe also makes it hard for anyone else to look at that and be like, well, how am I even getting into this? And then you're looking at the situation today, like, and it doesn't even seem to matter anymore that you have essentially so much more knowledge accessible at your fingertips. It's just, it's too much noise almost to get in anymore,
Yeah. I'm actually, as you were talking, I was thinking about this from a perspective that, we built our business in the Netherlands, and we basically enjoyed the benefit of Europe going online and the internet basically, really taking off and expanding throughout Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and then ultimately reaching over into Asia and bringing on China and bringing on Southeast Asia. But the thing is that I keep thinking about, and this is something that just kind of gives me even more pause, is when you think about what effectively the world is in today, if you look at today's context, that there's kind of this, boohoo globalization, there's this nationalism that's rising, you begin to see how, if you just look at how the video games industry expanded over the past 20 years, really riding globalization, really riding that expansion, it's easy to then see how, as we go inwards, or as nationalization starts to take off, there theoretically should be a growth of local talent. There should be basically inner city. There should be basically more minority contribution and participation. I don't want to basically attribute that to nationalism, but I can definitely see how one would start to think that would start to happen. But then again, in order for that to take place, that would then mean the opportunities of computer ownership, internet access, education, healthcare, because, if you're sick, you're not going to think about it, would need to ultimately be there as well. So I guess this is something that I'm kind of, I'm confused on, given that I'm back here in the States now, looking at this and realizing there's a tremendous amount of people that could absolutely positively join the games industry. If we can get them skilled, if we can get them trained. I mean, there's 40 million unemployed people right now. The chances of some of them being able to work in the games industry, I wouldn't put it past them, given the fact that it's not like we went to school to learn how to make video games. We were just a bunch of nerd kids that basically figured out how to use a tool. So I guess that's more of a statement when I'm looking at this right now, because honestly, if you think about this from this perspective, looking at the situation now, we have global circumstances. You have COVID everywhere, which means people are working from home. People are basically have embraced technology to basically work and collaborate together. The games industry, for those that can work together, are basically, working remotely. But then we also have a trade war between the United States and China, which, God knows where that gets to. But, we're already seeing that just in microprocessors and silicon, they're battling it out. And then, of course, there's these travel restrictions because of COVID as well. So from that standpoint, you got this understanding there's this massive untapped labor force in all countries. But, given the fact that I'm looking towards the US right now, that basically pulls an interesting part of this, which, well, let me ask you this question. What do you think, with what you're hearing me saying, would be necessary for anyone out there listening to us saying, hey, I want to get into this space? What would you tell them? I mean, how would you basically go about doing this if you were starting now?
Like if you wanted to get into the industry right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like you want to get in the industry now?
I think it's, you almost have to for a moment, not look at right now, because really the situation is so exceptional out there. But, just looking at assuming that you don't have to worry too much about virus or riots right now, or just taking a step back. I think that the opportunity is going to be huge for anyone to get into the game space, because it is, if you find the right people, and very welcoming community, especially the independents, and that includes even some larger studios that sell independent. The main thing is that don't think you need credentials, from schools and things like this to get in. In fact, it's something that might hold you back, right? If you can, ideally learn by yourself. And here's the one thing that you probably have been told your whole life, that you need to be amazing at math, and you need to be, amazing in business and all these things, and learning all these skills that are technical, engineering related to get into games. But that isn't really true. And the truth is that you don't necessarily need school to teach you how to learn either. The main thing is find something you're excited about, expressing your creativity in video games. If that is something that you get into, and you've maybe dabbled a little bit with making things, or just making a game even on pen and paper, that's probably enough to honestly get in and express your creativity, or just find something, get some tools, get the engines, and get going. And you will probably learn in a way that you've never done in your life, right? You'll probably experience excitement of figuring out new things that you've never really seen before. And essentially you have to unlearn this thing that I think is in a lot of cultures. And I think in America, it's definitely a thing where it's that certain topics are boring, or certain topics are not for you, or it's you couldn't ever understand how this works, right? You need to ignore all of that and essentially just find your own way through. And I think that's the opportunity that I see, is just by going for it and finding your own voice and contributing that. Nowadays players, they actually really do reward creativity and a unique game experience, something they haven't seen before, right? So it's actually a very good time to get into the industry with something novel. People have sort of reached this point where graphics are just amazing. Everything looks awesome. It looks like movies nowadays. If you spend the money, you can make it look like that. Because of that, I think, it kind of levels the playing field, where even a game that looks much more casual, much more simple, can come in, as long as it has that kind of that flair, that energy that sets it apart. It's just something really cool about it. And that is made by two people in some basement somewhere. That's totally fine, right? So it's just getting in there and being able to take that risk, right? Then you're off to the races. That's really how I see it.
So then this is interesting because, at this moment in time, we've always known that basically technology in video games has a homogenous issue, where basically there seems to be a dominant certain background that honestly at one point in time, we're now seeing changes started to happen here. And obviously, statistically speaking, there are more graduates now coming from Black and Hispanic universities, or I should say graduates that are graduating in computer science. But, putting school aside, saying that you don't need to have the credentials, you just need to jump in and you need to take a chance, that really then would bring in the next question, which is, okay, that's great. I want to take a chance. How do I go about doing that? And from that standpoint, what it sounds like is that you're going to need to basically try to understand, well, what are your skills? Are you an engineer? Are you a designer? Are you an artist? Are you going to basically, download Real? I mean, what are we doing?
In the US, I hate to say it like this, because I do value education, don't get me wrong. But I think in the US, I would say, don't go to school learning games. I would just have to say it like that, because the student debt you're going to be stuck with is going to obligate you to join a large company immediately. And those companies will oftentimes have entrenched bias and entrenched sort of interests and systems in play that are not necessarily going to be for the best long-term development you want to have. Let me say this in short way, like you might end up getting jaded quite quickly and burn out and leave the industry. So the best way to get into the industry as an American, I think, is to do it, the way that you do it from home. Right? You do your job on the side, whatever that is, and then, you get a computer and you download a game engine and you get going. Just because you need to do it on your own terms. This industry is too volatile. This world is too volatile for you to be beholden, I think, entirely to doing the corporate rat race in that sense.
Well, the thing is, that's interesting you say that, because it's exactly how we started. If you look at the world today, 2020 looks kind of awfully familiar of 2001 from the standpoint of an economic collapse. Obviously, we didn't have a disease spreading, but we had war, we had 9/11, we had basically, unfortunately, we had minorities getting shot on the street still. That hasn't changed. And at the same time, basically, you have school costing a ridiculous amount of money. It costed a lot of money back then. If you think about how we basically came up as modders, how we came up basically starting Streamline, basically starving our way up, what we're talking about here then is basically this, is that you're not going to spend that money on the education, but you're probably going to take that money that you were going to spend on education and basically invest it into creating a demo, or effectively putting yourself into a position where you can actually sit down and put together something that showcases your capability. But a key thing that you said, and I think is very important, because this is something that we did as well, we still found a way to bring food to the table. And we did moonlighting. We did our side hustle. We did what we had to do. If I go back and I think about Streamline, I mean, we had that side hustle where I was working full time and basically bringing stuff home while you guys were doing what you needed to do to help make the demos. So we did what we had to do.
It is a little different now, though, where I think, for people that, don't necessarily want to start their own company, they have to do this contradictory thing where, like, they still need to be independent when they get in, do it by themselves. But there is, I think, a larger group of companies in between, that are not super corporate, but are sort of like, independent, work from home, just using, online communication, like 20 people type size companies. And there's a lot more of those, I think, than when we came up that you can join. But the main thing is you need to essentially approach that from the independent perspective, right? And I think I would say this way, that, as looking at the industry from the outside, the thing you connect with when you see it, I think, is the creativity, the fun, the energy, the really interesting people that you might meet there. That's how you see it. If this is what you care about, you need to stay independent to get in. You gotta kind of do it on your own, in my opinion, because the chance of you ending up in a place where you're sort of, living in, like, let's say, San Francisco, paying tons of rent, you're 35 years old, you're making a lot of money, but you're spending so much money on your rent, and you're just obligated to do the rat race in the corporations. And that's exactly it, is the corporations, right? If you want the creativity, you need to stay a little bit on the outside until you work your way up to find those mid-sized companies. Because if you just join an American corporation, it is literally just that. It's not going to feel much different necessarily than being in any other corporation. And this is where, the American corporate system, I guess, Alex, you know a little bit more about that. But, it is very biased. It is very one-sided. And you'll burn out and you won't come back.
Well, the American corporate system is interesting because right now, if we believe all the posts that have come out from all the players, and they're going to be making a difference. They're contributing millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars towards inclusion program, diversity program. I am hoping that basically makes the difference, because that will at least allow for more people of color, more people from the Black community, Hispanic community to join and participate in the games industry. But, like all things in life, one can talk and then execution is what we need to see. And I think this is also something, when I go back to thinking of my own career in this industry, that was one risk I couldn't take. I couldn't wait for someone to hopefully do something that would make a difference in my life. And that's the reason why I took the chance and took, matters into my own hands and effectively went looking for the opportunity. And I think this is something that I would definitely address for anyone that's out there in the audience that feels disadvantaged or feels like they have no options. You have to go out there and make them. And one thing I would say on this is, finding people who are willing to work with you, who have that same spirit the way you do, is absolutely essential, being able to connect. Now, one thing we do have is the internet, whereas back when we were starting up, we were connecting on bulletin board systems, and ultimately we found relationships that lasted, well, at this point, it seems like a lifetime, and we've been working together for over 20 years, Stefan. So I think this is something that for people out there, they should know. But the American system, corporate America. I mean, there's, movies have been made and stories have been told, but, one thing for sure, one of the things I'm very tired of is being the only Hispanic inside of the room that isn't either pouring coffee or cleaning the table in some of these boardrooms that I visit. It would be very nice to basically see other Hispanics, other people of color, more Black directors, more Black board members, more people of color in executive positions. That would be fantastic because, one thing is really clear. The industry for the past 20 years has been pretty much dominated by white people. And then at one point, Asian people now started coming into the mix because of the spread of globalization, which is fantastic. But it would be nice, specifically in the United States, for representation of the diversity of the United States to be reflected in the industry. But I guess this is why we're starting to see people of color in games, where we're seeing basically, all of these new organizations coming up that are effectively helping minorities and people of color in the games industry.
Yeah, and it is needed, actually, just talking from what we know about the industry. There's a lot of unhappy people in the industry. There are a lot of people that feel, companies are imbalanced. I mean, there's gender imbalance, there's, different cultures completely underrepresented. And beyond that, it's just oftentimes a work environment that isn't just fun. It's just not a good place sometimes to make games. And I think there are a lot of people that want to bring change to that, but it is hard because certain attitudes are so entrenched in terms of this is how it's always been. This is how you have to do it. And I think that there's a real pushback to really fix that. I mean, how do you even go about this, right? We have these studios that say like, this is how we've made games, and this is the kind of teams that we want to have, and we don't want to just add more people for the sake of calling it diversity. Like, how do you change that culture, of that company, or do you say, never mind, I'm just going to make my own? Is that going to become a partisan thing at that point? Can that be? Is that where we're going? Or is it rather going to be that companies really actually value, like, what we're going to make better products by having a more inclusive team? Like, which way is it going to turn?
Well, let's hope that it goes to a more inclusive team. I think in the end of the day, one thing is for sure, over the 20 years of business travel and flying around and effectively dealing with people, one thing I've noticed is that we all have the same hopes and dreams. We all want opportunity. We all want to basically progress and see our social economic standards increase. I think this has been one of the things that was really difficult. I'll be honest with you. I don't think we've ever really fully talked about it, but one of the hardest things over the past 2 decades was knowing full well that basically the opportunities we were creating in other parts of the world weren't being translated to the community I came from. And mainly that was because of the fact that my community wasn't able to participate. And this is something where, the difficulties that I think that, we face in the United States as minorities, as Hispanics face, not only within the community, but within discriminatory practices that take place. It's a bit of a pain. And, obviously we've had the fortune and we've been blessed to basically, live in Europe, live in Malaysia, grow our business, do business all over the world, and see these different points come together and experience the economic prosperity. But it is really strange to say, drive up and go see people I know and go to other communities in other parts of the city and realize that, this just, I live on planet Mars. Video games is like, I guess you could say it like this. Video games are great that, all of us can buy them, but when it comes to the people who make them, they look nothing like the people that are actually purchasing them. And,
I think the narrative seems to be like, this is outsourcing, like this is done in other countries, right? But I remember like a time where like, people would say like, oh, you're outsourcing to Eastern Europe, that's cheap labor, blah, 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 but then from one day to the next, suddenly like some of the biggest titles on the planet are made there. Nobody even blinks an eye. right? So it suddenly turned from outsourcing to, yeah, of course, I mean, they're good developers, right? They just changed almost like overnight, So there's this excuse that oftentimes is used for a while, like, you're not bringing those jobs here because it's cheaper elsewhere. It's cheaper in Europe, it's cheaper in Eastern Europe, or wherever the frontier currently is in terms of where it's cheap. But the truth is that the prices around the world are beginning to actually equalize quite a bit, right? Things are not anywhere really just like super dirt cheap. It doesn't work that way, right? It's expensive to make any type of game. So with that in mind, like you said, there's really no reason why these jobs couldn't come to the US unless it is just so entrenched in the culture that, these kind of opportunities are either done by communities that is not me or us, or simply that it couldn't be, risked where I live type of thing. Right. And that is really the dilemma there. Just simply
yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, that's the $1 million question right there. Are we going to see a renaissance in our Black and brown communities within the United States from the participation in technology and video game development and creative industry? Or are we going to see this just continuing to be a story where the offshoring, outsourcing, effectively the push of globalization continues to bring in other countries, which I think obviously that will happen because, other countries have the right to grow and contribute and give to their people, which I'll tell you, one of the things that I've been very happy about has been seeing the prosperity we've been able to be a part of to help people pull themselves out and basically bring themselves into middle class. But that is definitely a story that gets to happen in the United States as well. That's something that should happen here. But, you're right. It comes down to culture choice. It comes down to basically if we can eradicate bias, if we can basically understand that inclusion from all of our constituents, all of our citizens is good for business. And I think that's that's the $1 million question right there.
It's very strange when you think about it. Let's just, simplify it a little bit. But let's say, okay, on the bigger scheme of things, cost is not going to be the issue. Like you don't need to do your work at a third of the price where you live, to compete with, China or whatever, Europe, Eastern Europe or something. That's not how it works anymore. Costs are going to be equalizing. So you can live in the US and you can do, a job in games and you should be able to be fine. So that's not it. In terms of education, we had established you don't necessarily have to go to a school. You can pretty much self-learn if you find the right community. So that's also not a problem. So where is it stuck, right? What is it holding it back? And it's simply probably just, I think honestly, like there comes a point where people are like, still having this attitude of like, that's nice, you guys essentially can play with toys, and it's very frivolous that what you guys are doing. I can't take those risks. I have, a mom, I have to take care of her or something like this, and I need to make money now, right? And I get that. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. It's like if you have that pressure, you're really going to spend your extra money, not take care of your family, but rather buy a computer, sit in your room for 3, 4, 5 years with seemingly nothing to show for it, and then it'll turn into a job, right? I mean, I understand that essentially at this point it's the system itself that keeps you locked in, and I think this is why right now the game development community is actually really trying to, at least the indies, let's say it, I think, trying to push for, look, find a way out. We'll support you. We'll find a way to mentor you, to bring you into our teams, to break that out of there. Because if they just, if there's a way for them to see, like, like I can make money in games, right? The same way that in other countries, like suddenly, like, I mean, what was it, like 30 years ago in India, they were like, IT totally works for us. Cool, just make that work. And suddenly it became a thing. Right? What is it going to be? What is that moment where, like, suddenly, in a country like in the US, all the communities can be like, I can totally make money in games. It totally is going to work for us, right? To break out of this. What is it going to take?
So what I'm thinking what it's going to take is basically what's just happened. I actually think, and perhaps I'm an optimist, but I'm also a realist, that the riots, the protests, the senseless murders, the nonstop nonsense coming from our, politicians, certain ones, basically has made the breaking point happen. When you then layer the fact that basically you could survive COVID but get shot by the police, that kind of put things into perspective where I think at this moment in time, more than at any other time in U.S. history, people are now aware of the plight of Black, brown, and minorities in the United States. And their children are basically not wanting to be a statistic. They're not wanting to end up basically face down in the street with someone's, knee on their neck, let alone basically doing low paying jobs. They want to basically be part of this revolution that's happening. And I think this is something where the digital divide specifically is starting to change over. And I think this is something where at this moment in time, whereas in 2000, the number of people with computers that were Black and Hispanic was so low, that has actually changed. Let's talk about what those numbers are in terms of basically where it is at this moment in time. Looking at it right now, 1 in 3 African Americans and Hispanics, so roughly 14 million and 17 million respectively, well, they still don't have access to technology in their homes. Similar, oh my God, really? 35% of Black households and 29% of Hispanic households do not have broadband. Holy shit, nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed.
Like, there's just an access to technology. That's a
there you go.
Problem.
I mean, I guess the optimist in me basically just got silenced by the facts in me.
That what that means? It's they make choices, right? They say, look, we need to take care of our families. We don't have time for spending on entertainment, right? And I think this is where the games industry is sometimes doing a disservice to itself in terms of the jobs opportunities that it presents, because it presents itself as join to be creative, express yourself, find your inner voice, all this stuff, that's all true, I guess. But at the same time, if I hear this, if I can put enough food on the table for my kids, I'm going to be like, I don't have time to express myself for shit. I need to just go and do whatever job I can get, right? Because it becomes just entertainment. It becomes frivolous when honestly they could make, jobs happen in there for themselves. It could be hugely, life-changing for them. But, are you really going to think of it that way when people present the games industry as this place of like creative expression and peace and harmony, when it's all sort of the inverse, right? It's not always peaceful, but at the same time, it is a job where you can actually really make money and be successful, as a creative, as an artist, animator, programmer on the business side. But I'm telling you, like, if you get categorized into like entertainment and like you say, like, we don't even buy broadband. We can't afford entertainment. We need to just take care of each other. I get why they would never join the industry, because it seems so out there, like it seems like a job that in that sense, I guess, like that white people do. It's like, they can afford to just send their kids to art school, right? Is what it sounds like. Not seeing that, it doesn't matter anymore. Like, you can do it.
Well, so that's interesting that you say that, and you're right, because you know what? I can go back to when my grandpa was looking at us on a computer thinking that we were just being lazy and strange. I guess you could say even antisocial. Basically, no one understood it. And honestly, my family didn't understand it for a long time. My cousins did, but it wouldn't be until basically our business really started taking off that people started to understand, like, oh God, there's an actual business here. You're actually eating. You're actually making money. Now, one thing that is important, though, for the community, and this is something that I think is important for everyone to understand, you don't know you can do something unless you see someone like you do it. And this is the importance of role models. This is really, when it comes down to it, in the end of the day, if you want to mimic, and people mimic all the time, you need to see someone successful from your community, from your neighborhood, who is being successful in the space you want to be in. And this is also one of those things in games. You look around. Where are they? I mean, I can say it from Hispanics of Hispanic descent. Where are they? And this is interesting. Where? I mean, and I will say one thing, it's one thing to be the talent. It's another thing to actually be the owner, the publisher, the person who in the end owns the intellectual property, which I think is something that a lot of people, and just in video games in general, a lot of developers seem to forget. And this was a huge issue in the double O's, having your IP taken, selling your IP, or effectively being strung along. So, I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of things we start to unpack when you think about this from a standpoint of inclusion and getting more people to participate. the amount of knowledge that will need to continue being shared in order to make sure people don't go from basically disadvantaged and excluded to included, but yet still disadvantaged, or in this case, being taken fully advantage of, kind of much the way external development or outsourcing did basically in the double O's, when there was the almost quasi-imperialist nature of some people to go out there and basically pillage the land. Let's hope that doesn't turn into you know what, let's go to the inner city and go get it for cheap. Because that would be, obviously the worst thing to happen as well.
I think one problem that is just sort of inherent to how games are made is that it is generally, I think, more of a team effort, right? And a good, healthy team, you will have maybe 10, 15 people that all, I think, more or less equally contribute to making a game a success, right? I mean, at least I think for our products, I can see it, and I've seen it with other successful teams. You don't usually have this one kind of genius guy that just sticks out and makes it happen, right? So because of that, it's always more of a team thing. That is good for the team, because it feels really nice. But at the same time, it is definitely something that a exploitative corporation or a company can lean into, and essentially more or less says the only thing you'll see from our product is our brand, right? So it washes out the creators a little bit, or just kind of like diffuses them, right? So these voices of really interesting people in that kind of entrenched way of presenting products gets kind of like eradicated. I mean, you can probably say like this is like the top 5 of creators that in the game space, like Kojima and a few others. That's about it, right? But like you say, like there are tons of role models, for across the spectrum that have contributed to your favorite games. But especially for the larger games, those corporations go safe, and essentially those voices generally are somewhat discouraged from going out there and really broadcasting their opinions, I think. Right? I mean, yeah, you get like the main guy, maybe here or there, like the creative director of this or that. But, there were like 300 people on that game, and a lot of really damn smart people worked on it across all of these different backgrounds, right? And they're usually, sort of muffled. It's not easy to kind of get approval to go out there and talk about it because of how complicated these games are, right? So that, I think, is a huge advantage you have in something like films, where, like, there's some roles that are kind of protected and easily to see. This is the director, right? I mean, even just the last few years, like, for example, like, Black American directors have made some incredibly cool movies, like Jordan Peele and those guys. Get Out and all that. It's like, wow, I want to see more of what this guy is coming up with. This is just, every movie he makes is just intense, right? But I remember that name off the top of my head because, in movies you have these kind of keystone individuals that you will eventually get to know. And I think that is a big problem in games, that by the nature of games, it is a bit more flat in terms of making a game a success. And then that habit essentially got entrenched into the corporations, especially to just kind of like discourage really highlighting individuals. And that brings us to where we are now, where like, a decade or two will pass and you don't really see a lot of voices coming out. Right. I mean, even with Kojima, remember, like, he got ousted by his previous company, and this whole thing turned into drama because he was, I guess, too big of a name for the publisher, right? It's crazy. Like, why does it have to be this way?
Well, I think what that comes down to is basically we're going to more than likely have an entire episode focused on creatives and basically the stars. Where are the stars in video games, and how is the dynamic between publisher and creator, developer, how that all kind of mixes up? One of the things that I think is important on what you just went on, is basically the understanding of talent and access. Ultimately, in the end of the day, our industry does better when everyone does better. And that is true. If you think about over the past 20 years, we have seen what were walled gardens and basically gatekeeper ecosystems. Digital distribution totally disrupted that. Indie revolution made it possible for people to make games without a publisher. Basically, the expansion of and globalization of our industry, so that development was happening worldwide. That markets opened up, like China and Southeast Asia, where basically new consumers came online, allowing for effectively participation at every level, at least from a geopolitical standpoint. Now, looking from a socioeconomic standpoint, specifically countries that have populations that are disadvantaged, their opportunity getting here is quite tremendous. I think the one thing that I'm realizing as well that I'm looking at is that on one side, we do have basically a, digital divide that, race plays a lot to do with it in the United States. But there's also another divide, which is something that we've talked about, which I think is important to talk about as well. And that also comes down to basically an income divide, basically what can you afford? So when we look at the 40 million people that were laid off in the United States, the average salary these people were making was under $30,000 a year. And when you look at basically the statistics of computer ownership with anyone making less than $30,000 a year, it's almost impossible. One of the things that we were just looking at right now was basically they're saying now that nearly 1 in 5 teams can't finish their homework because of the digital divide, mainly caused by the fact that your income, roughly 1/3 of households with children aged 6 to 17 and whose annual income falls below $30,000 a year do not have high-speed internet connection at home, compared with just 6% of the households earning $75,000 or more. You think about that for a second. How much you earn determines what you have access to. And that is, that's nuts.
And it's so sad, because, as a parent, you're going to be like, I want to do the right thing. I'm going to get my kid educated because this is how you protect yourself, right? Get educated, join, a school. So if you convince, your parents, if you will, to actually get into a creative field, from a marginalized background, you say, I'm going to take the risk, and your parents are like, okay, cool, do it, son. I want you to be happy. You go to a school then, and you end up with like tens or hundreds of thousands, I don't know, like tens of thousands of dollars in debt, right? It just immediately is like, that might have been a mistake. And that's so sad because it sounds like this is exactly the right thing to do. Go to school, be smart, But then in the games field, this just sets you up, for spending 3-4 years in something you have to pay for. It actually sets you back. And it's very counterintuitive, to think of it this way.
So those numbers came from the Pew Research Center, and that was basically an article from October 26, 2018. I can tell you in the age of Corona, I'm sure those numbers did not improve that much. Looking at it, and if we start to kind of wind it down, kind of bring it in and distilling it to what effectively it is, video games in itself is one of the greatest social economic tools I think anyone in any country, any background could potentially get involved in. It's an industry that's ever growing, skills and capability that translate not only in the video game space, but to pretty much every space that is going through some form of digital disruption. The reality is how we make games will translate into how we do just about every aspect of work, whether that's through the training or effectively through interaction, collaboration, UI, UX design. All of this is coming into every aspect of daily life. But there is something to say that the ability to include new voices, to have new ideas, and to have those backgrounds only make this industry stronger, and they make them better. Obviously, I think Streamline in itself and our journey, Stefan, with building this company reflects just that. And you look at all the different people, the different backgrounds, you see all the different social economic circumstances, and then you look at effectively what we've been able to create just as a team. And that by itself, you're talking about a bunch of kids who basically had no money when they started a company to basically where we are now. And, clearly it works.
Yeah, I think, I have a lot of hope for the independents, to be honest. I think there's a lot of great communities. You can see them active on Twitter, you can see them active on Discord and other places. A lot of people are kind of helping each other, waking up to some of the injustices that are going on and how you can make a difference there and helping other people and lift them out. It'll be one by one at the beginning, but these teams, they will become companies, and those companies will become the new mid-level size companies, the independents essentially of our industry. And this is where the real change will come from, right? Like, it's not going to be the 3,000 person company. It's going to be the 30 person company that can afford to be a little bit spunky, independent, work from home, take chances on some crazy people, that have cool ideas. They're going to make the real transformation happen, and it is going to happen. And it's, they're not going to be sort of held back by some of these old preconceptions. So I'm quite positive about that aspect, but it is going to require a real push, a real broadcast to essentially break this this preconceived notion that may be settled into some parents or some people in particular, like of, you can't do it, or you need to be educated in a certain way, or it's too risky, or it's too frivolous, right? The truth is, it can be anything that you want it to be. It can be an amazing career. It can be a great business. It can be a creative endeavor. It can be definitely hard at times, and there's a lot of injustice at times that does need to be addressed. But there's a transformational force that you can have as a person that wants to be creative, wants to be technical, to get in there and really make a change happen.
And I would say, with the next gen change upon us, indie games raging, the fact that online publishing or self-publishing is possible, there's never been a greater time to get into the games industry than there is now. The opportunities are ripe. And of course, given the fact that content, games, and people's desire to basically do something when they're locked up inside continues to grow, it's definitely something to consider if you're coming from any disadvantaged background, but specifically if you're coming from the Black community, from the Hispanic community, or people of color. Definitely look at getting into the video game space. It will definitely change your life and give you an opportunity that you didn't even know was possible.
The contradiction, of course, is, I just thought about this, is like, what are we saying, essentially to those communities as an example, right? Don't get an education, get broadband instead, right? That's a tough sell. And I mean, obviously, we're not even reaching that audience because we're talking online, right? So that is the problem, isn't it? So it's really about people that maybe, having, cousins coming up, friends coming up right now, that are maybe not thinking of it this way. It's really sort of one-on-one, kind of telling them, hey guys, this might be interesting for you guys, and essentially try to convince your parents or your grandma, just get that broadband. Just start there.
Well, okay, so let's talk about this. I don't necessarily think that we're saying don't get an education. I think we're saying is don't get a video games education, but I think it's okay if you get a computer science degree. I mean, hell, get a computer science degree. In fact, go get a CS degree. That's probably the best thing to spend your money on, as well as being able to write and basically, being able to speak, because your soft skills are going to be important. What we're saying is basically, be smart about if you're going to go learn specific skills that are going to get you ahead. In this case, computer science is probably one of the best things. Learn to be an engineer would be phenomenal. But that all starts with you having access to technology. So yes, get broadband. Make sure you get broadband. And if you need to sell that you're going to get Netflix for your family, fine. But then take that broadband, go visit those forums, do the research, do the Khan Academy, get yourself Unreal, start teaching yourself how to do things, and basically learn. So this is really, let's break this down. I'm a 12-year-old. Like, we're talking to our 12-year-old selves. I can tell you right now, if I could go back in the DeLorean and basically, go back in time, which I'm sure no one will know what I'm talking about, except for the few that watched, okay, maybe a lot of people know what I'm talking about. Probably people our age will know. But, if you could go back and basically look at myself, I'd say, hey, listen, you know what? Keep reading, keep learning, and basically forget anything else. Don't listen to anyone else. Keep doing what you're doing, and you're going to go far, because in the end of the day, that knowledge has been so key. It got me to where I am. So any of those kids out there, I would tell you the same thing. Learn. Just keep learning. That's really the key.
Just tinkering, exploring. I mean, it's also like it's Roblox, it's, even Fortnite, all that stuff. It gets you out there, gets you talking, gets you exposed to other things. So, I mean, I'm actually quite okay with all of that. Like, become a streamer, get it out of your system. And then, you're going to ask other questions. What else could I do? What else can I get involved with? All of that will work out, I think. So, I mean, for me, like, I very much believe in the sort of the independent approach. But yeah, I mean, if you want to do a balance, right, you want to sort of still make some money, then yeah, do the computer science degree, go to school. But then you got to understand, time flies. And as you sort of pay back your student loans and you make your first job happen in games, look around, learn, how is this business operating? What's successful here? What isn't? And then don't get stuck and don't get jaded. Look around for other studios that might work better if the one that you're in is not for you, right? Because there's a risk of getting stuck, right? And like getting into the rat race of, like, I guess, corporations, this is how games are made. And then essentially your soul has been sucked dry. And then 20 years later you wake up and you're like, shit, right?
Well, look, okay, yeah, clearly. I mean, this is, again, coming from the people who never went to school, right? And then in the end went to school later. So, I mean, I guess Here's the thing. If you're willing to basically bust your ass, do whatever it takes, start a business or work with a group of people, and you're good at learning through experience, then by all means, what Stefan's saying is exactly it. That's exactly how we did it. We just jumped in and, devil may care, and went after it. And, basically here we are 20 years later. But at the same time, we also understand that, it takes a lot of independence, a lot of accountability, a lot of dedication, and a lot of focus, and a high tolerance to risk to be able to say, you know what, devil may care. I'm just going to do what I want to do. And whatever happens, happens. So it really comes down to the attitude. It comes down to your disposition. What are you willing to risk in order to get that reward back? And I think that's something, Stefan, that, let's be honest. If you would have known when you were 20 years old what it was going to take for us to do this, would you have still done it?
I don't know. Like, I go through waves. Sometimes like, yeah, for sure. Other times like, oh God, that was crazy. It's a mix. But I think what I would have told my younger self, maybe not my 12-year-old self, but I think really early on is you're going to hear this line if you get into the corporate side, which is like, this is just the way it's been done, or this is how we do it here. And there's a sort of a vibe of like, this is just how it is, right? And that is probably a sign of sort of not the right work atmosphere, because the answer should be like, well, why? What else could we do? Or we could do it like this, we could do it like that, right? That there's a change, right?
Everything's just policy. This is how it's always. What the thing is?
Policy, and
I know. Such a weak answer.
The one thing that we should share, is that this is a line that you hear all the time. I think, especially if you're an employee, at a game studio, especially the bigger ones, this is just what it is. Take it or leave it. And it's sort of like this is the vibe in a lot of the teams there, right? They then try to apply this to us as a company coming in and being like, sort of hardballing us on certain, things that maybe going to put in contracts. And as you push on them and you're like, well, why? And why not like this? Why not like that? They're like, yeah, I guess that's okay. So change can happen. Change can be done. These policies, these contracts are not set in stone. And so I think because of that, the teams are not set in stone. They're nowhere near as inflexible as they think themselves they are. Right. So you can be an agent of change if you are working in one of these companies and you see things going weird and it's just not really the best way, like, not just from production sort of managing perspective, but just like the team, the kind of the way that the team kind of communicates with each other, and all that stuff, and the kind of team that you want it to be. You can change it. You just have to get into that collision course and be ready for that. But I think it is the better way, right? Because if you don't do that, then you just settle for the like, well, I guess just this is how it is. That's how it's always been. That's what they're telling me. You're gonna get your soul sucked dry. And in games, you kind of need your soul because it's a hard job, right? And you need to be able to harness that creative fun. That passion needs to be there for you to get you through the tough launch days and all that stuff. And so, otherwise,
you don't want to be jaded. You don't want to become one of these people that hate what they're doing. And it's weird. I always found that fascinating. We ran into people in the industry that hated what they were doing or hated what they became. And then, at first I'm like, why would you ever get that way? But when you take a step back and you realize just how this industry chews people up and spits them out, how it crunches the shit out of them, or how it basically puts them in a position where they basically just don't understand just, how someone can be so damn barbaric towards them. I mean, I get it. I mean, you see what that is. Now, granted, I don't think it's as extreme as it used to be, but, I do get why there are these people, and you're totally right. You just cannot be losing that optimism and that creativity and that spark to basically a soul-sucking, crushing environment that basically treats you like a battery and says, now do my work. Obviously not.
Yeah, I think this is really important because if you're telling people on one end, like that, let's say you don't have to go to school, you can learn by yourself, use your passion, your energy, go to Khan Academy, upgrade your skills, and you'll find a rewarding job. But then when you get into the job, you're being told like, this is policy, this is how it's always been, and then you get your soul sucked out of it. Like you're and then you're going to fail essentially your parents that said like, that trusted you when you said, you're going to get involved in something that'll pay off for you guys. Right? Because then in the end, like you're going to burn out and fail out of that. And essentially just, you already made it in. You had your success already. But because you were in some bullshit team that essentially just stonewalled you when you asked for change to make it a better, more creative place, a more inclusive place, then that is the real tragedy. right? So that's why it kind of has to be this two-punch approach, I think, where it's like, if you have the confidence to sort of defy expectations and get into this space to begin with, learn your way into that, hustle your way to get that first job. That is one step out of two. Now, the second step is don't put up with this kind of like, it's always been this way type thing, because it is going to crush the creativity out of you. And then you're not going to be able to sustain yourself in the job. It's just not going to be possible, right? So you need to be able to do both, I guess is what I'm saying.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that this was a pretty rip-roaring conversation. Definitely something that, we opened up quite a bit of thoughts. I'm sure we didn't answer all the questions, but, for those out there listening, please feel free to submit comments and questions to us. We will be doing more episodes in the coming future, obviously wanting to interact with our community more and see and hear what you guys have in mind. You can always follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Twitter. We will go ahead and set those things up so you can see them. Stefan, what is your Twitter handle?
Nerdy Narrative.
And my Twitter handle is StarveUp. You can go ahead and find us there. You can go ahead and hit us up and ask any questions you want to hear. So if you are curious at all about video game development, you want to hear the real talk, you want to hear about what it takes, definitely tune into Video Game Real Talk with your hosts, Stefan Baier and Alexander Fernandez. Do you have any other words you want to impart on our guests, or I should say in this case, our audience?
Well, thank you guys for joining in. Like and subscribe, as they say. I think. Well, I mean, for me, like you heard me talk about, the revolution. Because that's one way to do it. There's a lot of ways that you can do it. You have to find your own way. But in the end, feel free to reach out to people that are in the industry. Talk to us. Talk to other folks. A lot of people are very positive, opening up right now in particular. They want to help. They want to see more voices. They want to see that success come to everyone that could be a voice. Right? Never let anyone tell you no. And if you can be part of that story, then hopefully, here we are for that.
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a great point. Never let anyone tell you no, and never believe that you can't. You just got to go for it, and you'll make it happen. Thanks for listening, and we will see you guys next time.